Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover how to train the glutes and hamstrings for maximum muscle growth. First, let's look at the anatomy of the glutes and hamstrings muscles. In terms of the hamstrings, we have three primary muscles. First is the biceps femoris, which is located on the outer part of the back of the thigh, the semitendinosus, which is in the middle of the back of the thigh, and the semimembranosus, which is located on the inner side of the thigh. For the glute muscles, we have the glute max, which is the biggest and most superficial glute muscle. The glute medius is a smaller muscle located more to the side of the hip, and we also have some smaller glute muscles like the glute minimus and piriformis. However, these smaller muscles are located underneath the larger glute muscles and therefore aren't really relevant to physique goals. The three hamstring muscles all have similar anatomical features. All three muscles originate on the pelvis and insert on either the tibia or the fibula, which are the bones of the lower leg. This means that all three muscles act on both the knee and hip joints. It should also be noted that the biceps femoris has two heads. The smaller short head actually originates on the femur, however this doesn't have much relevance to hamstrings training. The glute max originates on the pelvis and the bottom of the spine and inserts onto the femur and also the IT band. These fibers run in a mainly vertical direction, but they are somewhat horizontal. The glute medius originates at the top of the pelvis and inserts on the femur. These fibers essentially all run in a fairly vertical direction, but the muscle is located more on the side of the hip. The glute and hamstrings muscles act on two primary joints. The first joint is the hip. The glutes and hamstrings perform two primary actions of the hip joint. These are hip extension, which is when the hips are straightened out from a flexed position, and the second is abduction, which is when the leg is moved outward from the midline. The second joint these muscles act on is the knee. They only perform one primary action of the knee, which is flexion. This is when the calf moves towards the back of the thigh from a straight position. Because we have a group of many different muscles act to perform different movements. In terms of hip extension, all glute and hamstring muscles act to produce this movement. So the three hamstrings muscles and the two main glute muscles all contribute to hip extension. In terms of knee flexion, only the hamstrings muscles perform this movement, as the glutes don't cross the knee joint at all. And for hip abduction, only the glute max and glute medius contribute to this movement. There are 5 exercise categories which can be used to train the glute and hamstrings muscles. Trainees don't have to include all of these exercises in their training program. They can choose the exercises they prefer in order to emphasize particular muscle groups. The first exercise is an isolated hip hinge movement. These are exercises which involve pure hip extension with no movement at the knee. Hip hinge movements are probably the overall most effective exercises for glute and hamstring development because they will train all of the glute and hamstrings muscles. This is because all of these muscles perform hip extension and will therefore contribute to the exercise. Some examples of these exercises include stiff leg deadlifts, good mornings, and back extensions. The second exercise is a squat pattern. These are exercises which involve simultaneous hip extension and knee extension. While knee extension won't contribute to training these muscles, the hip extension action will. As we just mentioned, all of the glute and hamstrings muscles perform hip extension, however squat exercises won't maximally train the hamstrings. This is because the hamstrings are a biarticular muscle and also perform knee flexion. During a squat, we have hip extension, but also knee extension, which means the hamstrings will be contracting at the hip joint, but lengthening at the knee joint. This means they won't really be recruited because the joints demand two opposing actions simultaneously. So the glutes will be maximally recruited with squat exercises, but the hamstrings won't be. Some examples of squat exercises include back squats, split squats, and lunge variations. Next, we have hip thrust variations. These are exercises which involve simultaneous hip and knee extension like the squat pattern, but these have a horizontal force vector as opposed to a vertical. Here the tension is maximized at full extension as opposed to the squat where the most tension occurs in the bottom range. Once again, because we have hip and knee extension, the glutes will be maximally recruited, but the hamstrings won't be. Some examples of these exercises include barbell hip thrust and specialized hip thrust machines. The next exercise we have is leg curl exercises. These are exercises which involve isolated knee flexion without any movement from the hips. These exercises only recruit the hamstrings muscles because there is only flexion at the knee without any hip extension. There aren't many different leg curl variations, but any form of the classic machine leg curls fall into this category, such as lying leg curls or seated leg curls. And the last exercise category that can potentially be additionally effective is hip abduction exercises. This refers to exercises which involve isolated hip abduction without any movement from other joints. These exercises will specifically emphasize the glute medius, as its anatomical position makes it primarily an abductor rather than a hip extensor. The glute medius will already be trained through any hip extension movements, although if trainees specifically want to emphasize the lateral region of the glutes, then hip abduction exercises may be additionally beneficial. There aren't many hip abduction variations, but there are a few different hip abduction machines that can be used to train the glute medius. And lastly, let's cover some unique technique considerations to maximize development of the glutes and hamstrings. While glute and hamstring training is fairly straightforward, there is one unique consideration that should be noted. This is the pelvis and spine position of certain exercises. The position of the spine and pelvis can influence the tension that is placed on the glutes and hamstrings. In particular, it will influence the involvement of the hamstrings during hip hinge movements like the stiff leg deadlift and good morning. Because the hamstrings attach onto the bottom of the pelvis, extending the spine and anteriorly tilting the pelvis will put the hamstrings under a greater stretch, and rounding the spine and posteriorly tilting the pelvis will shorten the hamstrings. Therefore, when performing hip hinge movements, we want to avoid any rounding of the spine at all. As soon as the spine goes into some flexion and the pelvis goes into a posterior tilt, the tension comes off the hamstrings and gets redistributed to the lower back. Therefore, we want to keep a neutral or slightly extended spine and maintain this as rigidly as possible throughout the entire movement. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.